Chapter 1. The Funeral. No one attended. My name is Laura. I am 33 years old, and on the day I laid my husband David to rest, not a single member of my family came. While I stood at the cemetery in Chicago holding the hands of his grieving parents, my mother, father, sister Rachel, and even Jessica, my childhood best friend, were hundreds of miles away in New York, raising champagne glasses at Rachel's lavish engagement party. That was the moment I understood the cruelest wounds come not from strangers, but from those who should have loved you most. The rain had been falling since dawn, cold and relentless, soaking through my coat as I stood in the cemetery just outside Chicago. I barely felt it. All I could focus on was the casket lowering into the ground, the dull thud of wet earth echoing inside my chest. My husband David was gone, and with him the last piece of the life I thought I had built. Beside me were Thomas and Helen, his parents holding each other, their faces lined with grief and exhaustion. They had stood with me through every appointment, every sleepless night, every final breath. But on the other side, the space was empty. My own family had chosen not to come. The silence pressed in heavier than the rain. No whispered condolences from my father, no hand on my shoulder from my mother, no familiar faces from the people who should have been there for me. It was as if the world had decided I was meant to carry this alone. My body felt like stone, unmoving as the casket sank from view. I told myself to breathe, but even that seemed impossible. The vibration in my pocket startled me. For a moment I thought absurdly that it could be David. Old habits die hard. I pulled out my phone and saw the message from my mother, Margaret. "We need to talk when you are ready." That was it. No, I am sorry. No, how are you holding up? Just a cold, distant message, as if my husband's funeral were nothing more than a formality before we got to the business she really wanted to discuss. My fingers trembled around the phone, and I slid it back into my pocket before Thomas or Helen could see. I forced myself to look at the headstone, temporary for now, a small plaque with David's name and the dates, 1988 to 2023, 35 years, too short for a man who still had so much to give. I closed my eyes, and in that moment I was back in the spring of 2012, walking across the campus at Northwestern University when David first smiled at me. He was carrying a stack of textbooks, his shirt slightly wrinkled, his hair too long, and his grin made me forget every worry I had about finals. He asked if I wanted coffee. I said yes. That was the start of a story that I thought would last forever. We married in 2016 in a small chapel on the north side. My parents came, but even then I could feel the disapproval radiating from them. My father, Edward, shook David's hand stiffly, as if the contact itself were unpleasant. My mother barely spoke to him, choosing instead to fuss over my sister Rachel, who arrived in a designer dress and announced she had just been promoted at her law firm in New York. I remember standing there, bouquet trembling in my hands, realizing that in their eyes, Rachel would always be the one worth celebrating. The years that followed were full of small rejections, little cuts that built into deep wounds. Family holidays where Rachel's achievements were paraded, while mine were dismissed. Conversations where my father would ask David about his work, with a thin smile that barely disguised his disdain. I wanted to believe that time would soften them, that seeing how deeply David loved me would matter. But time only seemed to widen the distance, and yet with David I had everything I needed. He would come home from his engineering job exhausted, but still smiling, always ready to cook dinner or listen to me vent about a difficult client at the marketing firm. He loved hiking, and we spent weekends on trails near Lake Geneva, talking about the future we were building together. We dreamed of children, of a house filled with light, of growing old side by side. Now that dream was buried beneath wet earth. The rain eased for a moment, and I could hear Helen's soft sobs, Thomas whispering something to her that I could not make out. I stayed silent, my lips pressed together, afraid that if I opened my mouth, the grief would pour out like a flood I could never stop. My hands clenched the umbrella so tightly my knuckles burned. I thought of my family again, sitting in their warm home in Boston, probably talking about Rachel's upcoming wedding, perhaps even laughing. I imagined Rachel waving her diamond ring in front of them, Jessica by her side, the two of them sharing secrets I was no longer part of. The image burned into me, cruel and sharp. David deserved better. He deserved a farewell surrounded by love, not an empty row where his in-laws should have stood. And I deserved better than a mother who sent me a message like a business memo, devoid of compassion. The priest said a final prayer, his voice muffled by the wind. When he stepped back, the workers began to shovel the first mound of soil. Each sound of earth hitting the casket was like a drumbeat inside my chest. I wanted to scream to stop them, to demand that the world recognize what it had just lost. But I stood still, silent, staring until the wood disappeared from view. I placed a single white rose on top of the mound and whispered goodbye, my voice trembling in the damp air. Then I stepped back, my shoes sinking into the mud, and I felt the weight of everything pressing down on me at once, the grief, the loneliness, the betrayal of my own blood. As we turned to leave, Thomas gently took my arm, his touch steady, grounding. Helen gave me a faint smile, eyes red and swollen. They were grieving too, yet they had not abandoned me. That small comfort was the only thing keeping me upright. In the car ride back, I stared out the window, watching raindrops race each other down the glass, my reflection pale and hollow in the blur. The text from Margaret echoed in my mind over and over until it was all I could hear. "We need to talk when you are ready." I knew even then that whatever she wanted to discuss would not be about David or about me. It would be about control, about money, about Rachel. It always was. And as the city lights came into view, I realized that the funeral had not been the end. It was only the beginning of something darker. Chapter 2. Love and Contempt. I remember the first time I met David as clearly as if it happened yesterday. It was the spring of 2012, the air on campus carrying that mix of damp soil and blooming trees, the kind that makes you feel like anything is possible. I was juggling a stack of books outside the library when a guy with messy hair and tired eyes stopped in front of me. His arms were full of engineering textbooks, and he grinned like he had known me forever. He asked if I wanted to grab coffee, his voice easy and warm, and before I even thought about it, I said yes. That yes changed everything. We spent hours that first afternoon at a little cafe near Northwestern talking about music classes and what we wanted out of life. He told me about growing up in Milwaukee, about his dad Thomas fixing cars in a tiny garage, and his mom Helen pulling long shifts as a nurse. His family had little, but the way he spoke about them, there was so much pride. I told him about Boston, where I grew up in a big house filled with rules, expectations, and constant comparisons. I tried to explain my parents' obsession with my younger sister Rachel, but even then I struggled to make it sound real. David listened, his eyes steady on mine, and I felt like for the first time someone actually saw me. By 2016, after years of studying long-distance phone calls and weekends squeezed between internships and exams, we stood in a chapel in Chicago with only a handful of close friends. I wore a simple dress, David wore a suit that didn't quite fit, and when we said our vows, I knew I had chosen the right life. His parents cried tears of joy, clutching each other's hands. My parents were there, stiff and polite, their faces betraying nothing but mild disapproval. Margaret leaned over to whisper to Edward, more than once her eyes on Rachel, who had flown in from New York in a designer dress that caught everyone's attention. People kept asking her about her new job at Harper & Ross Law, and she lapped it up. I stood there holding David's hand, trying not to notice the way my parents' eyes slid past us and landed on her. That was the story of my life. Rachel had always been the shining star. The perfect grades, the Ivy League law degree, the glamorous Manhattan career. At every holiday table, she was the pride of the family, the one whose stories filled the room. Meanwhile, I was the daughter who had chosen marketing, the one who had married a man from a working-class background. No matter what I achieved, it never seemed to count. David never let it bother him. He would tell me late at night that people like my parents measured worth in money and prestige because they did not know how to measure kindness or loyalty. He would brush my hair back and tell me he loved me, and in those moments, I could almost believe it did not matter. But deep down, it always did. One evening in the summer of 2019, we drove to Boston for a family gathering. Rachel had just been promoted to senior associate at her firm, and my parents decided to host a dinner in her honor. The house was filled with catered food and expensive wine, laughter bouncing off the high ceilings. David tried to make small talk with Edward, but my father barely listened, asking vague questions about renewable energy before quickly steering the conversation back to Rachel's latest case. Margaret hovered like a shadow, filling Rachel's glass, introducing her to every guest as if she were royalty. At one point, I sat down at the long mahogany dining table, listening as my father raised his glass. He looked around the room, his eyes shining with pride. To Rachel, he said, the pride of this family, the daughter who carries our name with distinction. Everyone clapped Rachel, beaming, her diamond bracelet glittering under the chandelier. I froze, my smile plastered on my throat tight. I felt David's hand on my knee under the table, steady grounding, but it did not stop the sting. Across from me, Rachel caught my eye and smirked, the corner of her mouth lifting in silent triumph. Jessica was next to her, my childhood friend who had once sworn we would always be on the same side. She leaned close to Rachel, whispered something, and both of them laughed softly, their eyes flicking to me. It was subtle enough that no one else noticed, but I did. The sound of their laughter cut deeper than I expected. I sat frozen in that moment, wine glass untouched in my hand, realizing how completely I had been pushed to the margins. My parents, my sister, even my closest friend had created a circle I no longer belonged to. I stared down at my plate, trying to steady my breathing while the celebration around me roared on. David squeezed my hand under the table, his thumb brushing across my skin, and whispered that we would be all right. But inside, I felt the first real crack that would one day split everything wide open. The night dragged on, Rachel dazzling guests with stories about New York, Jessica chiming in with admiration, my parents glowing with pride. I moved through the room like a ghost, smiling when spoken to, nodding at the right times but feeling invisible. Later, as we drove back to our hotel, I pressed my forehead against the car window, watching the lights blur past. David reached for my hand, his voice gentle, as he told me that someday my parents would regret the way they treated me. I wanted to believe him, but in my heart I knew better. When we got back to Chicago the next day, I tried to push the memory away. I focused on my job, on our little apartment, on building a life that was ours alone. David filled our home with laughter, with warmth, with plans for hikes and projects and dreams. But in the quiet moments, the echo of that dinner lingered. My family had made it clear where I stood, and I could not shake the fear that the distance between us would only grow. I told myself it did not matter that I had David, that love was enough. I wanted so badly to believe it. But the truth was already taking root deep and quiet, waiting for the day it would rise to the surface. Chapter 3: Illness and Indifference. January came down like a curtain, heavy and cold, and with it the feeling that something inside our life had shifted. David started waking with headaches that pulsed behind his eyes. He would rub his temple and tell me it was just the winter air and too much screen time, and then he would lace his boots and go to the office at Green Future Energy anyway. One morning, he set a coffee mug on the counter and missed the edge by an inch. It shattered on the tile. He stared at the pieces as if they belonged to someone else. I drove him to Northwestern Memorial and held his hand while a tech slid him into the machine and the room swallowed him with its metallic hum. A neurologist sat with us afterward and spoke carefully about an aggressive tumor and the plan to move fast. Surgery was not a cure. Radiation and chemo would not be a cure. We would aim to buy time. 9 to 12 months. The words landed like ice water and kept spreading. David nodded and asked focused, practical questions about dosage and schedules and side effects, as if this were a project plan he could manage with a spreadsheet. I watched his mouth move and tried to memorize the shape of his courage. On the way home, snow began to fall in small, dry flakes that clung to the windshield. David rested his head against the glass and told me he did not want me to carry this alone. I told him he would not. That evening, I emailed my manager and HR and requested extended leave under FMLA. The reply came back quickly and kind. I cried from relief and fear at the same time, then stepped into the bedroom and began to fold his softest t-shirts into a bag for the hospital. Thomas and Helen arrived from Milwaukee the next afternoon. They moved through our apartment with quiet purpose, stocking the fridge, washing dishes, setting up a corner with blankets, so one of them could sleep by the couch when David was home. Helen smoothed his hair with her nurse hands and told him that he was not defined by this. Thomas tightened a wrench under the sink and said he needed the job done anyway, and then he sat on the rug and played cards with David between appointments. Their presence steadied the room. I called my parents in Boston once I could speak without shaking. I told Margaret that the doctors had found a brain tumor and that treatment would start immediately. I asked whether she could come for a week. She said travel was difficult with everything going on and that we should try to stay positive. When I called again after the first round of chemo, she mentioned that Rachel had picked a date for her engagement party in New York in late summer and that the hotel was already booked. She hoped the timing would not interfere with our care plan. She asked me to send a save-the-date list to relatives who might not be on social media. I listened to her words and stared at the bruise blooming on David's arm where the IV had been, and felt something inside me go very quiet. Rachel called me a few days later. She said she was sorry to hear about David, but also that Harper and Ross had just staffed her on a major client and she was working late every night. She suggested I try a meditation app she used during stressful trials. She asked if I had seen the email with details about her venue. I told her I had. She sounded relieved. She added that she would try to swing through Chicago in the spring if her calendar opened up. The line clicked softly when she ended the call. I stood in the kitchen and listened to the refrigerator motor buzz, then put my head down on my arms and breathed. Jessica texted that weekend and offered to bring over a stack of frozen meals. She arrived with a smile and a bag of soups and a bottle of fancy juice and told me she would help organize a rotating schedule of friends. It sounded like a plan. The schedule never appeared. She canceled twice with client emergencies and then once because she was flying to New York to help Rachel look at dresses. When she did come by, she took photos of the meals lined up on our counter and said something about wanting to post a reminder to support friends in crisis. I watched David stare at the wall while she talked, and I felt a heat crawl up my neck that I was ashamed of. When she left, I locked the door and stood with my forehead against the wood until the feeling passed. Treatment began in February. Our days fell into a rhythm of early blood work and long hours in waiting rooms and a walk around the block when David felt steady on his feet. On good days, we sat by the window at home and he sorted through old hiking maps and told me about the ridgeline near Lake Geneva where the pines sang when the wind moved. On bad days, he slept so hard I checked his breathing every few minutes. I kept a notebook of medication times and side effects and questions for the doctor. I labeled pill bottles and learned to coax him to sip water when his mouth tasted like metal. I trimmed his hair when it began to fall in clumps, and when the clippers left his scalp bare, he touched the mirror and said that he still felt like himself. I told him he always would be. Money crept into the edges of every thought. Insurance covered more than I feared and less than we needed. I paid bills at the kitchen table at night and watched the numbers shrink in our savings account. David told me to use the emergency fund without hesitation. I did not tell him that every time I transferred money, I felt like I was buying time and losing it at the same moment. Susan from work dropped off gift cards and a blanket and said the team missed me and that the company would hold my position as long as they could. I thanked her and closed the door and cried into the blanket because the kindness made everything hurt more. I kept my parents updated in short messages. Edward wrote back once with an article about a supplement he had read about and suggested we try it. Margaret sent a line that said to keep him comfortable and that worry had never helped anyone. When I asked if they might visit in March, she replied with a note about a trip they had already planned. Rachel sent a photo of a floral arrangement she liked for her party and asked my opinion. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred and then put the phone face down and sat with David while he slept. Spring pushed through the Chicago grime with small, stubborn flowers along the sidewalk. David and I walked to the corner park when he felt strong enough. He liked to sit on a bench and watch a Labrador chase a torn tennis ball. He would say that a day with a dog was a good day. I would press my knee against his and pretend that the world had shrunk to the size of that bench, the smell of cut grass, the warmth of his shoulder through his jacket. In May, Jessica came to the infusion center for the first time. She hugged me quickly and sat in the chair by the window and told me a story about a celebrity client who wanted a kitchen island in imported stone. She set her phone on her knee and its screen lit up every few seconds. David smiled at her and asked about her projects. She glanced at the IV line and changed the subject to a new restaurant opening in the West Loop. After 20 minutes, she stood and said she had a site visit she could not miss, but that she was thinking of us. She kissed the air near my cheek and walked out. I watched her reflection disappear in the glass and felt a flatness spread through me like ink in water. I told myself she had a life to live. I did not say out loud that I was losing mine. Summer was a slow burn of hospital corridors and laundry and careful meals and moments of light that felt like gifts. Thomas repaired a wobbly table leg, and Helen made a chicken soup that David could keep down. On a warm evening in July, we sat on our building's steps and watched a storm roll in from the west sheets of lightning flickering above the skyline. David rested his head on my shoulder and said that the clouds looked like mountains and that he wanted to hike again. I told him we would, even if it was only a small trail with lots of benches. He closed his eyes and breathed in as if he could store the smell of rain somewhere safe. In August, a thick envelope arrived addressed to me in Margaret's handwriting. Inside was an engraved card with gold edges announcing Rachel's engagement celebration at a Manhattan hotel in late September. There was a registry link and a note that asked guests to RSVP by the 1st of the month. I set the card on the counter and stared at the date until the numbers stopped making sense. David was due for another round the week before. He had begun to stumble when he walked to the bathroom at night. I put the card back in its envelope and slid it into a drawer. Jessica texted a few days later asking if I had seen the invite and whether I would need help finding a dress. I typed that I would not be able to travel and then erased it. I typed that I did not know and erased that too. I finally wrote that we were focused on treatment and that I hoped the party would be beautiful. She sent a string of hearts and wrote that Rachel deserved a night that felt like a movie. I placed the phone on the table and went to sit on the floor beside the couch where David slept, his breath slow and uneven, his hand loose in mine. As September approached, the calendar on the fridge filled with follow-up scans and appointments. The neurologist adjusted medication. David told me he wanted to be at home as much as possible. I called the home health nurse and learned how to manage the equipment we would need. In the quiet hours of the night, I made lists I never showed anyone. Things David loved, things I should tell him while there was time, things to ask the doctor even though I knew the answers. One afternoon near the end of the month, Jessica stopped by the hospital again. Traffic had been bad, and she only had a few minutes before a client dinner. She checked her watch, and told me that New York in fall was magic. She asked if I would at least FaceTime into the party for a toast. I looked at David sleeping with a line of sweat at his hairline and told her I would think about it. She stood, squeezed my shoulder lightly, and said I was strong. Then she was gone. I walked to the window and pressed my hand against the cool glass. Outside, the trees along the street had started to turn a few leaves, already releasing, drifting down in lazy spirals that did not care who watched them fall. Chapter 4. The Final Night and the Engagement Party. September settled over Chicago with a heaviness that pressed into every hour I spent in the hospital. The fluorescent lights hummed above me, the machines at David's bedside flickered with numbers I could barely understand, and his hand lay in mine, warm but weak. His breathing had grown shallow, uneven, the pauses stretching longer, each one a small cliff I braced myself against. Nurses moved quietly in and out, their voices low, their eyes kind but careful, and I knew what they were not saying. Late that night, as the city outside quieted, I stepped into the hallway and pulled out my phone. My fingers trembled so badly I nearly dropped it. When my mother's voice answered, the words rushed out of me. I told her David was fading quickly, that I did not think he would survive until morning, that if she wanted to see him to see me, she had to come now. There was a pause, and through the receiver, I caught the faint sounds of music, laughter, the clinking of glasses. Then Margaret's voice came cool and steady, telling me they were already in New York for Rachel's engagement party, and that leaving was out of the question. I pressed the phone tighter to my ear as if that might change her words, but they landed sharp and final. I whispered goodbye and hung up before my voice broke. My legs gave out beneath me, and I slid against the cold wall, sitting on the tile floor with my face buried in my hands. The celebration in the background of her call echoed in my mind, so cruel in contrast to the beeping machines behind the door I had just left. When I went back inside, Helen was stroking David's hair, humming softly, as if he could still hear her. Thomas sat upright in the chair by the window, his jaw clenched, his eyes red. They looked at me, and they knew. They had heard enough of my side of the call to understand the rejection. Neither said a word. Helen reached out and took my hand, her touch steady, her eyes filled with a sorrow that made me feel less alone. The hours that followed blurred into one long stretch of waiting. I sat by David's bed, whispering stories from our years together, trying to fill the room with something more than the sound of machines. Sometimes his fingers twitched around mine. Sometimes his eyes opened for a fleeting second, the brown of them still soft, still him. At one point, he managed to form words faint and broken, telling me he loved me. He told me I would survive this even if I did not believe it. I bent close and pressed my forehead to his, promising through my tears that he would always be with me. Near 3 a.m, his breathing shifted. Each inhale shallower than the one before, each exhale longer, stretched thin, as if it might not return. The nurse stepped closer, adjusted the monitor, then looked at me with the kind of silence that tells you everything. I climbed carefully onto the bed, cradled him in my arms, and felt the final tremor of his chest as the last breath left him. In that moment, the machines fell quiet and the world seemed to tilt. Thomas stood and placed a hand on my shoulder, his voice breaking as he told his son goodbye. Helen sobbed openly, clutching the edge of the blanket, her body shaking. I held David tighter, unwilling to let go, whispering words I could not even hear through the roar in my head. He was gone. My partner, my best friend, the man who had carried me through so many storms, gone before the sun could rise. When I finally pulled myself away, the nurse moved gently, shutting off machines, straightening sheets, leaving us space to grieve. I walked out into the waiting room, my body numb, and reached for my phone again. I do not know why. Maybe I hoped for a message, some acknowledgement from my family that they cared, that they understood the gravity of what had just happened. Instead, my screen lit with notifications from social media. The first photo filled me with a coldness I could not describe. Rachel stood in a shimmering dress, her arm looped with Jessica's, both of them, smiling, wide champagne flutes raised. The caption from a guest read, "A perfect night for a perfect couple." Behind them, chandeliers glowed, golden tables glittered with flowers, and my parents stood in the background, their faces proud, radiant. I scrolled with shaking fingers. More photos. Rachel showing off her ring while Jessica clapped beside her. Margaret beaming at her younger daughter as if nothing else in the world existed. Edward with his hand on Rachel's fiancé's shoulder, grinning as though he had never known sorrow. Laughter and light spilled from every image, while only hours earlier I had been begging them to come to witness the end of a man who had done nothing but love me. The contrast was unbearable. Death in one room, champagne in another. My heart breaking in silence while my family cheered in a ballroom hundreds of miles away. My best friend smiling next to the sister who had always eclipsed me, the two of them united in a world I no longer belonged to. I set the phone down on the chair beside me and pressed my face into my hands. For a long time I sat there rocking slightly, trying to contain the storm building inside me. The walls of the waiting room felt too close, the lights too bright, the air too thin. When I lifted my head, the first trace of dawn was seeping through the hospital windows, pale and gray, casting everything in a muted glow. I walked back into David's room where his parents still sat. Helen had her head on Thomas's shoulder, her face drained, her eyes hollow. I stood by the bed one last time, touched David's hand still warm, and whispered goodbye again. My tears slid onto the blanket, disappearing into the fabric like they had never been there at all. Outside, the world carried on. Cars moved through the streets, the city waking as if nothing had shifted. But for me, everything had split wide open. In one night, I had lost the love of my life, and the people who should have stood by me had chosen to raise their glasses somewhere far away. My world had broken in two, and I knew nothing would ever fit together the same again. Chapter 5: The Brunch Video and the Ugly Truth. The days after the funeral passed in a blur of exhaustion and silence. I drifted through each morning like a shadow, answering calls from the funeral home, signing papers I barely read, standing at the window with a cup of coffee gone cold in my hands. Thomas and Helen stayed for a few nights before returning to Milwaukee, their grief raw but steady, their love for David still wrapping around me like a fragile safety net. When they left, the apartment felt unbearably empty. I checked my email one evening, half-heartedly clearing the endless notifications. My eyes landed on a name I had not seen in months, Mark, one of David's colleagues from Green Future Energy. The subject line was short, "Just thinking of you." My chest tightened as I opened it. The message was brief, expressing condolences, but then he wrote that there was something I should see, something he thought I deserved to know. At the bottom was a video file. I hesitated before clicking. My stomach turned, my pulse racing, but I pressed play. The footage was shaky at first, a camera phone capturing a long table set with white linens and champagne flutes. Laughter spilled over the background noise of clinking dishes. I recognized the hotel ballroom immediately from the photos I had seen online. It was Sunday, the morning after Rachel's engagement party, the brunch. The camera steadied on Rachel, her hair perfectly styled, her face glowing. She raised her glass and said loudly, "Laura always exaggerates everything." The table erupted in laughter. My chest tightened as I watched Jessica lean in, her voice clear. She loves to play the victim. The laughter swelled again. I waited for someone to object, to change the subject, to defend me. No one did. The camera panned briefly, and there were my parents, Edward and Margaret, sitting close together, nodding along silently. My mother's smile was small, but unmistakable. My father leaned back in his chair, expression neutral, but not once did he speak up. They had all sat there while my husband was buried, while I stood in the rain alone, and mocked me as if my grief were entertainment. I closed the laptop quickly, my hands shaking. The sound of their voices echoed in my head, louder than the hum of the refrigerator, louder than the traffic outside, louder than my own pulse. My knees buckled and I sank to the floor, pressing my palms against my temples as if I could push the words out. I whispered to myself that it was not real, that maybe the video had been edited, but deep down I knew it was the truth. Memories crashed over me in waves. Rachel smirking across the dinner table in 2019. Jessica's laugh at the hospital cut short when she checked her watch. Margaret's disapproving glances on my wedding day. Edward's silence every time I begged for a kind word. All of it had led to this moment crystallized in a single video clip that stripped away any hope I had left that their actions were mistakes or misunderstandings. The tears came hot and fast, blurring the edges of the room. I thought of David, how he had always believed people could change, how he had told me to give them time. I wanted to scream that he was wrong, that he had been too kind, too forgiving. I pressed my face into my hands and sobbed until my body ached. When the sobs finally subsided, I sat in the stillness of the apartment staring at the blank laptop screen. The anger rose slowly, a heat that burned away the numbness. They had not just abandoned me, they had ridiculed me. They had turned my pain into a punchline over brunch clinking glasses, while my husband's body was lowered into the ground. I stood and began pacing the room, my hands clenched. I replayed the video in my mind again and again. Rachel's voice sharp and mocking, Jessica's laugh, my parents' silence. I thought of the message my mother had sent at the funeral. "We need to talk when you are ready." Now I knew what she wanted. It was never about comfort. It was about control, about whatever came next about Rachel. It always was. I tried to sleep that night, but the images would not let me. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, my body tense, my mind churning. Every breath felt heavy. At one point, I reached for David's pillow, pulling it close, burying my face in the fabric that still held his scent. I whispered to him, telling him what they had done, asking him what I should do. No answer came, only silence, and the sound of my own heart beating too fast. The next morning, I forced myself to shower, to dress, to move through the motions of a day. But inside, I carried that video like a wound that would not close. I replayed it in my head while I made coffee, while I walked down the block to check the mail, while I stood at the sink scrubbing dishes that did not need scrubbing. Every second reminded me that the people who should have loved me most had not only failed me, they had laughed at me. By evening, the anger had sharpened into something colder. I knew there was no going back. The part of me that had clung to hope, that had prayed for reconciliation, was gone. What remained was a clarity I had never felt before. The truth was undeniable, now captured in pixels and sound. My family had chosen their pride, their image, their favorite daughter over me and over David. I sat at the kitchen table, the envelope from Rachel's engagement still tucked in a drawer nearby, and stared at the dim light filtering through the blinds. The apartment was silent, except for the tick of the clock on the wall. My chest rose and fell slowly, the tears long dried. In that quiet, I made myself a promise. Whatever came next, I would not forget what I had seen. I would not excuse it. I would not minimize it. The video was proof, and proof was stronger than denial, stronger than the lies I had been told my whole life. They had revealed themselves, and I could never unsee it. The air outside shifted as night fell again, the city lights flickering through the windows. I turned off the lamp, sat in the dark, and let the anger settle into me like steel, knowing it would be the thing that carried me through what was still to come. Chapter 6: The Inheritance Scheme and the Counterattack. A week later, the doorbell rang while I was rinsing a mug in the sink. I dried my hands on a dish towel and opened the door to find my parents on the threshold, Rachel just behind them with a leather tote, and Jessica hovering at the edge like she was not sure if she belonged. Margaret wore a dark coat and a smile that did not reach her eyes. Edward held a slim briefcase. Rachel stepped forward first and said they had come to settle a few things. Jessica gave a small wave that disappeared when I did not return it. They moved into the living room as if it were a conference room. Margaret sat on the couch back straight. Edward laid a stack of papers on the coffee table and slid a pen beside it. Rachel stood with her arms folded, her gaze sweeping the room as if assessing a client. I sat in the chair opposite and waited. Edward opened a folder and spoke in the careful tone he used when he wanted to sound reasonable. He explained that the family trust needed a simple update and that a deed transfer would clean up title issues related to the house in Boston. He said my signature would avoid complications for everyone. He did not look at me when he spoke the word everyone. I told them I would not sign anything until a lawyer reviewed it. Rachel sighed like she had expected the delay and began to explain that the documents were standard. Margaret added that it would be best to finish this quickly while we were face to face. The word we floated in the air like smoke. I picked up my phone and sent a message to Susan. I asked if her husband Richard could stop by. She responded within a minute that they were nearby and would come. While we waited, Edward tapped the pen against the table, and Rachel scrolled through her phone. Jessica stood by the window pretending to admire the view. She finally said that everyone wanted what was best for me. I looked at her and saw the brunch photo in my head, her smile as she lifted a glass beside my sister, and I said nothing. The minutes stretched thin until there was another knock at the door. Richard Miller stepped in with Susan at his side. He was tall, calm 45, with a rested face that made people tell him things. We shook hands and I handed him the stack. He opened the folder, read silently, flipped pages back and forth, and asked a few quiet questions about dates and signatures. He took out a legal pad and made notes in a neat hand. When he finished the first pass, he looked at me and spoke plainly. He said the papers attempted to amend a revocable living trust in a way that removed me from a share that had been described in earlier copies. He said the deed on the bottom sought to transfer any future interest I might have in the Boston house to Rachel now. He added that the timing raised concern. He said I was within my rights to decline, and that in his view the approach took advantage of my grief. Rachel laughed under her breath and said that I had always misunderstood legal matters. Edward frowned at Richard and asked whether he was sure. Richard asked them to show the original trust. Edward did not produce it. Susan sat beside me and slid her hand onto mine. The room shifted. The confidence in my parents' faces thinned. Richard turned back to the folder and pulled a page that referenced an existing mortgage on the Boston house. He traced a line with his finger and then looked up. He asked me if I knew I was listed as a co-borrower on a loan recorded 3 years earlier. The words did not make sense at first. I told him I had never signed a mortgage. He asked if there had been a time I was given a thick packet to sign that had been described as insurance or beneficiary updates. For a second, the dining room in Boston flashed before me. I saw a stack of papers I had been handed during a holiday visit, Margaret telling me it was routine. I felt weak in my chair. Richard asked for my permission to pull my credit report on his device. I nodded. He stepped into the kitchen with Susan, made 2 quick calls, and returned with a page on his screen. He pointed to a home equity line opened in my name, tied to the Boston address in late 2020. He said the payments were current, but that any default could put my credit and liability at risk. He added that if my signature had been obtained without informed consent, there were avenues to challenge it, but that for now I needed to place a fraud alert and a freeze with the bureaus. The room seemed to tilt as I absorbed the words. Jessica stared at the carpet. Rachel studied her manicure. Margaret gazed at the wall as if nothing applied to her. Richard closed the folder and said he advised me not to sign anything today, and that the documents should not leave my possession. Rachel stepped forward and tried to gather the papers. I laid my hand on them and did not move. Edward told me that families solved these things privately. Margaret said I was being ungrateful after everything they had done. Jessica finally spoke and said that everyone was exhausted and that dragging this out would only hurt me. I felt my pulse steady. I breathed in through my nose and counted to 3. I stood and told them there was something they needed to see. I connected my laptop to the television and opened the email from Mark. The video began to play, the camera shaky for a moment before resting on the long table at the hotel. Rachel raised her glass and smiled. Her voice filled my living room. She said that I always exaggerated everything. Laughter. Jessica leaned in and said that I loved to play the victim. More laughter. The camera shifted and caught my parents at the end of the table. They were nodding. The audio was clear. The room around me was silent except for the sound of their voices on the screen. When the clip ended, no one spoke. Rachel let out a quick laugh and said it was clearly a joke. Jessica said it was out of context. Edward said that people say foolish things at parties and that it meant nothing. Margaret folded her arms and said that I had no right to record private moments. I told them a colleague of David had recorded it. I told them he had sent it to me because he thought I deserved to know the truth. My own voice sounded steady in my ears. I was surprised by the calm. Richard cleared his throat and said that the video spoke for itself and that any further discussion of legal documents would be postponed. He added that continued pressure today could be construed as undue influence. He suggested they leave and communicate through counsel going forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Margaret stood and picked up her purse with a sharp motion. She told me I had always thought of myself as a victim. Edward said that I was making a spectacle. Rachel said that this was exactly why the trust needed to be handled without drama. Jessica reached toward me as if to touch my arm and then let her hand fall. I felt something inside me harden into a line I would not cross again. I told them that from that moment on I had no family. The words tasted like metal and freedom at the same time. I handed the folder to Richard and asked him to keep it. I walked to the door and opened it. No one moved at first. Then Margaret swept past me without making eye contact. Edward followed, muttering that I was making a mistake. Rachel paused long enough to say that I would regret embarrassing them. Jessica lingered, eyes wet, whispering that she had never meant to hurt me. I did not answer. I kept my hand on the edge of the door and waited until they stepped into the hallway. When the door clicked shut, the apartment exhaled. I leaned my forehead against the wood and counted my breaths. Richard set the folder on the table and said he would email a plan before the end of the day. He recommended a credit freeze and a fraud alert, and said he would request copies of the original trust and the loan file from the Boston Bank. Susan hugged me quick and firm and said she would bring dinner. After they left, I opened my laptop and placed the freeze, my hands moving with purpose I had not felt in weeks. The light outside had shifted toward late afternoon. The apartment was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than the one that had swallowed me after the funeral. I sat on the rug where David used to stretch after a run and looked at the empty space by the couch where Helen had once folded blankets. I felt grief press against my ribs, then I felt it recede a little, as if it recognized it had to share the room with something else now. I stood, poured a glass of water, and took a long drink. I looked at the television screen still dark from the video, and at the folder on the table that held the proof of what had been done. Then I turned off the lights and let the room settle around me, knowing the next step would begin in the morning. Chapter 7. Healing and Karma. Morning brought a thin light and a clear list in my head. I called Richard and thanked him for standing between me and the people who once called themselves my family. He said the requests had gone quiet after his email and that he was filing letters to the bank and the law firm. I called a realtor next and asked what it would take to sell the apartment. When I hung up, I stood in the doorway of the bedroom and knew I could not heal inside these walls. Everywhere I looked, I saw David. I wanted those memories, but I needed air around them. On the first weekend of October, I drove north until the city thinned and the water opened up beside the road. Lake Geneva looked the way it always had in our photos, a sweep of blue with tall pines holding the sky. I found a small house not far from the shore, white paint peeling at the edges, a narrow porch with 2 steps, a kitchen that smelled faintly of lemons from some past life. The windows looked out to trees that would turn soon. I knew right then that I could breathe there. Thomas and Helen came down from Milwaukee to help me pack. We worked in quiet rhythms, wrapping plates in old newspapers, lifting boxes to the truck, pausing sometimes when a photo surfaced that took our breath away. Helen tucked a sweater of David's into a separate bag and said it should go with me in the front seat. When we locked the apartment for the last time, I pressed my palm to the door as if I could leave a part of myself there as a promise. Then I drove to Wisconsin with the sweater on the passenger seat, the radio off the road ahead, silver in late afternoon light. The first nights in the new house were strange and gentle. Wind moved through the trees and the floorboards creaked as if the house was teaching me its language. I slept lightly and woke early, making coffee in a kitchen that did not know my grief yet. I walked down to the water and stood there until the sun lifted over the pines. I spoke to David in my head about nothing and about everything. It felt less like talking to the dead and more like finding the part of me he had steadied and asking it to stand up. I found a therapy group at a community center near the library. We met on Tuesdays in a room with mismatched chairs and a pot of coffee that always tasted slightly burnt. That first week, I sat near the door ready to leave if the words became too much. Instead, the room filled with a quiet kind of courage. People spoke about the awful and the ordinary braided together. A woman named Sarah introduced herself. 37, a teacher, her husband gone after an accident on a late winter road. An older couple, Elaine and Frank, came every week and brought cookies they claimed they had burned even when they had not. They spoke about their son with a softness that brought the room to stillness. After the meeting, Sarah touched my elbow and said we could take a walk if I ever needed to walk. I said yes and meant it. In November, I began to write at night when the house was quiet. At first, I typed a few lines, then pages. I wrote about hospital light and the weight of a phone left silent. I wrote about the way kindness vibrates inside the chest when a nurse tucks a blanket carefully. I wrote about the shape grief takes when it sits at the foot of the bed and refuses to leave. I posted the words on a simple blog because holding them only inside my body made it hard to breathe. People found the posts and left comments that sounded like they were writing to someone they had known their whole lives. A woman in Arizona said she read my words during her lunch break in the school parking lot and cried, then went back to class and taught math because life keeps asking you to do things. A man in Oregon wrote that he had not known how to speak to his sister until he read a paragraph about the day the machines went quiet. The messages did not fix anything. They made the room feel less empty. Early in the new year, I took long walks with Sarah after her last class. We talked about small victories. She said she had gone grocery shopping without leaving mid-aisle. I said I had cleaned the pantry and made dinner on a Thursday night. We laughed when we could. Sometimes we did not speak at all and just listened to our shoes on the sidewalk and the wind in the bare branches. Elaine and Frank invited me over for soup on Sundays. Frank told long stories about road trips in a car that never wanted to start. Elaine sent me home with leftovers wrapped in foil that felt like a blessing. The first crack in my old world arrived one cold morning in February. I was making tea when a headline blinked across my phone. Bradley Stone under review for irregularities in client accounts. The article was measured full of pending investigations, and no conclusions, but the tone was clear. I pictured Rachel reading the same words in a New York apartment that likely smelled like expensive candles. Part of me felt a flash of satisfaction, and then another part felt tired. I knew what Bradley's trouble would do to Rachel's plans. I also knew it had nothing to do with me. Later that week, I saw photos disappear from her social media. The engagement posts went first, then the comments about venues and menus. Silence followed. By June, the news felt closer. An old classmate from college sent a message asking if I had heard about Rachel. The firm had cut her loose after a client scandal. The email had the flat tone of someone trying to sound neutral. I sat at the table and stared out the window at the maple tree that had finally leafed out. I felt something like gravity ease inside my chest. It was not joy. It was the absence of the old order that had ruled my life without mercy. In group that week, I told Sarah that I did not know how to feel about the fall of someone who had hurt me. Sarah said it was enough to keep my eyes on my own road. Late summer turned to fall and the phone rang with a number I knew by heart. Margaret's voice was thin, a thread pulled too tight. Edward had suffered a heart attack. They were meeting with doctors, bills were stacking. She said we could revisit the trust and that perhaps there was a way to help family in times like these. I listened with the window open so I could hear the wind move through the trees. I told her I was sorry for the medical crisis and that she should speak with Richard. I said I was not able to discuss money. There was a pause long enough to feel like a lifetime. She ended the call without goodbye. 2 months later, a cousin sent a note that the Boston house was on the market. The photos showed empty rooms and a yard that looked smaller than I remembered. October marked a year since I had stood in the rain at the cemetery outside Chicago. I drove down the morning of the anniversary with a thermos of coffee and a bouquet of white roses from a grocery store that still opened early. The grass was damp. I knelt and pressed my palm against the cool stone. I told David that I had moved, that there were people in Wisconsin who made the days less sharp, that the night air by the lake could be soft. I told him about the blog. I told him about the headline and the job and the house in Boston. Saying it aloud made it feel like I was setting down a pack I had carried for too long. Footsteps crunched on gravel behind me. I stood and turned. Jessica was walking toward me slowly with her hands together like she was carrying something fragile. She stopped a few feet away and did not try to come closer. She said she had wanted to reach out but did not know how. She said she had watched the stories unravel and thought about the night she chose a party over a friendship and the way her laugh sounded in a room where my name was a joke. She said she was sorry. Her voice shook on the last word. I stood very still. The wind moved a strand of hair across my face and I tucked it behind my ear. I told her I heard what she said. I told her I was not ready to offer anything in return. She nodded and said she understood. She did not ask for forgiveness. She said she would keep working to be someone different than the person in that video. She looked at the stone and whispered a goodbye I could barely hear, then turned and walked back the way she came. I let my breath out slowly. I felt no triumph and no hate, only the steady knowledge of the boundary between us. Winter rolled in early and the lake iced at the edges. I kept writing. The blog found its own pace. Some nights, I closed the laptop and a message arrived from someone who had sat in a hospital chair just like mine. Other nights, I read old posts and realized I no longer needed to read them twice. At the community center, our group put up a small tree with paper stars. Elaine wrote her son's name on one and tied it carefully to a branch. Sarah baked cookies she said were ugly and then laughed when we told her they were perfect. We drank coffee that still tasted burnt and stayed until the staff flicked the lights gently as a sign it was time to go home. By early spring of the new year, news of Jessica traveled back through mutual friends. A client had left a public review that sliced clean. Other designers stopped tagging her. Invitations dried up. She moved through rooms that once opened for her and found the doors no longer wide. I heard it and felt nothing that resembled satisfaction. It felt like a weather report from a city I no longer lived in. One evening, I stood on the porch with a sweater pulled tight and watched the sky turn the color of late peaches. The pines darkened into tall silhouettes. Somewhere down the street, a screen door closed and a dog barked twice. I thought about what had broken and what had grown about loss, and the thin places where light still finds a way through. Then I went inside, rinsed my mug in the sink, and set it to dry. The kitchen warm with the quiet of a house that had learned my name. Chapter 8, Chosen Family and Final Message. By the time winter let go of the trees and the lake began to breathe again, 2 full years had passed since the night the machines went quiet. I woke early on a mild morning in May of 2025, the kind of morning that feels newly washed, and packed a small tin I had kept in the back of a drawer. Inside were the last ashes I had saved. I drove the short road to the public path and walked down to the shore where the pines leaned toward the water. The surface was glassy and pale, the kind of calm that makes you whisper without meaning to. I sat on a flat rock and rested the tin on my knees. The metal felt cool through my jeans. For a long time, I listened to the soft lap of water at the shore and the distant call of a boat horn. I told David what the house had taught me through 2 winters, how the floorboards had stopped sounding like strangers and started sounding like home, how the morning light in the kitchen could turn even ordinary coffee into something that steadied my hands. I told him about the group on Tuesdays and how Sarah walks beside me without needing answers about Elaine and Frank, and the way they make soup that tastes like kindness about Susan and Richard, and the quiet way they show up the second I need them. Saying their names felt like laying stones on a path I had learned to trust. I opened the tin and tipped a little into my palm. The ashes were fine as dust. The wind was barely there, just enough to carry what I released in a soft drift. For a while I did not move. Then I reached into my bag and took out the envelope I had not opened until the week before. Helen had given it to me months after the funeral, saying David had written it and wanted me to have it when I was ready. I had kept it tucked between books, afraid of what it might do to me. When I finally read it, I cried in a way I had not since the first week, not with panic, but with a clean ache. He had thanked me for loving him without condition. He had told me I was stronger than I knew. He had asked me to keep living for myself when he could not. I did not read the pages again at the lake. I did not need to. The words were in me now. I tipped the last of the ashes into the water and watched them dissolve into light. The air smelled like wet stone and pine. For the first time in a long time, I felt that strange mixture of sadness and peace that shows up when you finally do the thing you have been carrying toward for months. I stood, pressed my hand to the rock as if to mark the moment, and walked back up the path. That evening, I set the table in the small dining room that looks out on the porch. The plates did not match. The napkins were the kind you buy in a hurry. It did not matter. I simmered a pot of pasta sauce and chopped herbs from the planter that lives on the windowsill. When the doorbell rang, Sarah came in with a loaf of bread still warm from her oven. Elaine and Frank arrived with a pie that smelled like cinnamon. Susan carried a salad in a glass bowl with a crack near the rim and said it had been her grandmother's and still did its job. Richard set a bottle of wine on the counter and offered to open it. The house filled with the sound of shoes on wood and voices that did not need to be careful. We ate and talked the way people talk when no one is trying to impress anyone. Sarah told us a story about a student who wrote an essay that made her cry in the best way. Frank told a joke that made Elaine roll her eyes and then laugh anyway. Susan asked me about the blog, and I said the stories kept finding me, that sometimes I sit down to write, and a voice from 3 time zones away feels like it is sitting at my table. Richard said the letters from the bank had finally come, and that the file would close in my favor, his tone matter of fact, as if we were talking about the weather. I felt a current of relief move through my body in a slow, warm wave. I did not need to say the names of the people on the other end of that file. We all knew them. We all knew that chapter had thinned to a page, and then a line, and was almost gone. At some point, I stood to refill glasses and looked around at the faces in the low light. I thought about the word family and how it had always felt like something that belonged to other people. In this small room with a pie cooling on the counter and a dog barking in some neighbor's yard and the lake breathing beyond the trees, the word fit. Not because we share blood, because we share the work of holding one another up. After dinner, we moved to the porch. The air had the soft edge of early summer, and the sky was the kind of blue that seems to linger just to be kind. Fireflies blinked in the yard in small, patient pulses. Sarah tucked her feet under her and said that grief changes shape without asking permission. Elaine said that love does the same thing. Frank said he could fix the loose board on the step next week, and then laughed when I told him he did not have to. Richard leaned on the railing and listened the way he does when he is letting a room find its own center. Susan reached for my hand and squeezed it. No one said anything about how far I had come. No one needed to. Later, when the plates were rinsed and the door had closed behind the last hug and promised to see each other Tuesday, I stood in the quiet kitchen and let the evening settle around me. The clock ticked, the house breathed. I thought about Chicago and the rain at the cemetery, about a ballroom and a video that cut the last thread on the old map, about signatures I did not give and doors I chose to close. I thought about choices, about how some feel like cliff dives and some feel like opening a window, about how both can carry you into air you did not know your lungs could hold. I washed the last glass and set it upside down on the towel. Out in the yard, a single firefly lingered, blinking slow as a heartbeat. I felt the ache that will always be part of my body, the one shaped like the man I loved. Alongside it, I felt the steady presence of the people who had stayed. Both belonged. Both told the truth. I went to my desk and opened the laptop. The blog page glowed in the dark. I wrote about the lake and the letter I carry with me now, not in my bag, but under my ribs. I wrote about the table and the mismatched plates and the way laughter sounds when it is not covering anything up. I wrote about the kind of family you choose when the one you were born into chooses something else. When I hit publish, the page felt like a room with the door open. If you are listening and some part of this story sounds like your own, you can leave a piece of it here. If you have ever had to draw a line with people who share your name, tell me how you found your footing. If you are learning to set boundaries or trying to heal from a house that did not hold you the way it should have, say what has helped you breathe. If you have faced a loss that taught you where love ends and where love begins, again, share the moment you knew you would keep going. This space is where we can speak what once felt unspeakable and make room for one another to stand.